Some stories don't make it onto this show. Not because they're too small, because they're the kind you keep your voice down for. The kind that doesn't sit right once the lights are on. So we send those somewhere quieter, a newsletter called The Echo. And there's one waiting in it right now that you will never hear on this feed. A full story. Dug up, written, and told the only way Dust and Echoes knows how. It's free. I don't sell your email or send you weird stuff you don't want. I only send the weird stuff you do want. That's the deal. Sign up. I send you cool stuff, no garbage. So, go to enterthedust.com, leave your name in the dust, and the story will find you. Some things are better passed quietly. This is one of them. There is a hollow in the south of York County, Pennsylvania, where the road dips down between the hills and the trees close over it, like a pair of hands. And the people who lived nearby in the 1920s had a name for the man who lived at the bottom of it. They called him the Witch of the Hollow, though that was not what he called himself, and it was not what he was. His name was Nelson Rehmeyer, and he was a big and solitary and gentle-mannered man who grew potatoes on a hardscrabble farm and lived mostly alone with his wife and daughters up the road, in a marriage long since cooled into something distant, but not unkind. He kept to himself at the bottom of that dark cut in the land, and he was a powwow doctor, which in that country in that time was not a sinister thing at all. It was a calling. To the Pennsylvania Dutch families scattered through those hills, it was closer to a kind of prayer. He was past 60 by the time this story finds him, a broad and heavy man with a still face and big, careful hands, who had lived in that hollow most of his life. His wife Alice and their 2 daughters lived in a separate house a little way up the road in an arrangement long settled and without open quarrel. And he grew his potatoes and kept his own counsel at the bottom of the cut, where the daylight went early. People found him strange the way small communities find any man strange who lives alone and answers to no one, and that strangeness curdled easily into the word witch when it was spoken by people who were already afraid, but the ones who actually knew him and the ones he had healed reached for gentler words. He was generous with what little he had. He fed people who turned up hungry and gave a bed to those who needed one out of the cold. And he had years before laid his hands on a sick boy named John Blymeyer and drawn a wasting spell out of him. That is the detail in this whole account I cannot get past. The man Blymeyer would come to kill as the secret source of all his suffering was the same man who had once, when Blymeyer was small and frightened and unwell, made him well again. To understand how Nelson Rehmeyer ended up beaten to death on his own kitchen floor by people who believed they were saving their own lives, you have to understand powwowing, because the murder makes no sense without it. And once you understand it, the murder makes a terrible and airtight sense. Powwowing, which the Pennsylvania Dutch called braucherij, was folk healing, and it was a tradition the German-speaking settlers had carried across the ocean and kept alive in the back country for 200 years. A powwow doctor cured with words and gestures and scripture. You went to one the way you might go to a doctor and a minister at once. You had a burn, or a fever, or a sick cow, or a child who would not stop crying, or a run of bad luck that felt like more than luck. And the powwow would lay hands on you or speak certain verses over the trouble and draw it out. It was woven all the way through with Bible verses and the names of God. And the people who practiced it did not think of it as magic against their faith, but as a part of it. It was a country Christianity with its sleeves rolled up. Powwowing was not a fringe thing in that country. It was stitched into ordinary life. A child with a fever, or a cow that would not give milk, or a wart, or a burn, or a nosebleed that would not quit could all be carried to the powwow before they were ever carried to a doctor. And often the doctor was 20 miles and a day's lost wages away, while the powwow was the quiet neighbor at the end of the lane. The healer would murmur the words, sometimes in German and sometimes in a worn country English, and make the sign of the cross over the hurt, and speak a verse and tell you to go home and say nothing of it to anyone. The gift was held to pass in a particular way, from a man to a woman and from a woman to a man, and never straight down a line of the same sex, and it was believed to weaken if you charged too much for it. or boasted of what you could do. Nelson Rehmeyer carried it the way a man carries a trade he was raised into, without drama and without pride, and the people who came down into his hollow to be healed climbed back up out of it grateful. None of them in all those years climbed up out of it harmed. Most of it came straight out of a single book, a slim collection of charms and remedies and half-prayers that a man named John George Homan had printed in Reading back in the 1820s to gather up the old German folk cures before they could be lost. It was called The Long Lost Friend, and the country people believed it was far more than a book. They believed that whoever owned a copy and carried it on his person could not be harmed, that the book itself made you proof against fire and against drowning, and against the malice of enemies and the bite of mad dogs. It protected you. A copy of it was a shield you could hold in your hand, and Nelson Rehmeyer owned one, and everyone in those hills knew that he did. Homan himself was a real man, a German immigrant who put the old charms between covers so they would not die with the old people who carried them. He filled the book with remedies for man and beast, and with the long protective blessings the country folk prized most. And he printed in it a promise that the book itself shielded its owner, that whoever carried it could not be harmed by his enemies, and would be kept from fire and water and the malice of evil men. To a poor farmer with sick children and a thin field, it was insurance. And where the long-lost friend was gentle and Christian, there were darker books spoken of in the same hushed breath and feared a great deal more. The so-called 6th and 7th books of Moses, grimoires said to teach not healing but its opposite, and the deliberate laying on of harm. To believe in the one was to believe in the other, because if a book could shield you, then a book could be turned against you. And the same hills that trusted the powwow at the end of the lane also lay awake and wondering which of their neighbors had got hold of the other kind of knowledge. But every system of belief that can heal can also be turned to harm. At least in the minds of the people who hold it. If a powwow could draw a sickness out, then a powwow could put one in. And the dark twin of that gentle tradition was the hex. It was the belief that a person with the knowledge could lay a curse on you and sour your luck, and wither your crops, and sicken your body so that you wasted away with no fever, and no wound, and no cause a regular doctor could ever find. A hex did not announce itself. It worked in the gaps, and in the things that simply went wrong, and kept going wrong. And the only one who could lift one was another powwow who would tell you who had cursed you, and exactly what you had to do to break it. In the 1920s, there was a young man in York County named John Blymeer, and John Blymeer believed with the total conviction of a drowning man that he had been hexed. He had reason to feel cursed in the ordinary sense because his life had gone wrong in every direction it could go. He came from a powwow family himself and had some of the gift, or believed he did. And as a boy, he had even been taken to Nelson Rehmeyer once to be cured of a wasting spell, and cured he was. But his own powers seemed to fail him as a man. He could not hold work for long in the cigar factories and the mills. He was sick in ways no doctor could name, and sleepless and thin and plagued by the certainty that he was being watched and worked against. His marriage fell apart. He lost 2 children in infancy. He was, by any honest reading we can make of it now, a deeply troubled and very probably mentally ill young man drowning in a life that kept pulling him under. But he did not have the language of mental illness that a doctor today would offer him. He had the language of the hollow. And that language told him that a life which came apart this completely had to have been cursed by someone. He only had to find out who. It is worth staying with John Blymeer for a moment, because the easy version of this story makes him a brute, and he was something sadder and more frightening than a brute. He was born in 1895 into a family that carried the gift on both sides. And as a small boy, he was thought to be a promising powwow himself, but the promise curdled as he grew. He went to work young in the cigar factories of York, rolling tobacco in long rooms for long hours, and the light slowly went out of him. He married a woman named Lily, and the marriage failed. The couple buried children in infancy. And somewhere, in those gray years, he became certain that none of it was ordinary misfortune, and that he was being actively worked against by an unseen hand. Years before, a powwow named Andrew Lenhart had told him the thing that set everything else in motion, that he had been hexed by someone close to him. someone he knew and trusted. From that day forward, Blymere's whole life narrowed to a single question. Who? He carried that question from healer to healer, across the better part of a decade. A thin and haunted man asking everyone he met to look inside him and name his enemy. And the longer he went without an answer, the more certain he grew that the answer was real, and that finding it was the only thing left that could save him. So he did what you did. He went from powwow to powwow, paying what little he had, and asking each one to name the person who had laid the curse on him. He chased the answer for years across the county, and the chase itself became the shape of his life. And eventually he climbed the steps to the most famous practitioner in the region, an elderly woman near Marietta they called Nellie Knoll, the River Witch, who was said to be the most powerful of them all. Blymere put his question to her the way he had put it to a dozen others, and Nellie Knoll gave him what none of the others had. She gave him a name. The way the story comes down, she had him take a dollar bill from his pocket and hold it flat in his palm and look hard at the face of George Washington printed on it. And as he looked, she told him the face would change and show him the one who had hexed him. And Blymere looked. And Blymere saw, or believed he saw, the features rearrange themselves into a face he knew. It was the face of the gentle man at the bottom of the hollow. The same man who had healed him when he was a boy, Nelson Rehmeyer. Think about what that name meant to him. For years he had been hunting an enemy, someone cruel and hidden who had set out to ruin him on purpose. And the face the dollar bill gave him belonged to the gentlest man he knew, the very man who had once drawn a sickness out of him when he was small. But a mind that has decided the whole world is against it can fold even kindness into the plot. Maybe the healing years ago had been the trick. Maybe the cure had carried the curse inside it. Maybe the gentleness was only the disguise. Whatever Blymere told himself, he did not flinch from the name. He had wanted an answer for so long that any answer was a kind of relief. And a certain answer with a face and an address was the very thing he had been praying for. He did not stop to ask whether a man who had once made him well would have any reason on this earth to make him sick. He had stopped asking questions like that a long time before. He only knew that the search was finally over, and that the cure at last was something he could do with his own two hands. She told him more than the name. She told him how to break it. To lift the curse, Blymere had to get hold of Rehmeyer's copy of The Long-Lost Friend and burn it. Or take a lock of Rehmeyer's hair and bury it deep in the ground at 8 feet down, where its power could no longer reach him. Do that, she said, and the hex would shatter, and his life would come back to him. Blymere believed her completely because he had been looking for exactly this for years. And here at last was the cause of everything that had gone wrong, and the cure was simple, and the cure had an address. He did not go alone, and the reason he did not go alone is the most frightening thing about the whole affair, because a belief like this does not stay in one frightened head, it spreads. There was a farming family named Hess, whose luck had also turned hard, and whose crops were failing, and whose animals were sickening. And the Hesses had been told by their own consultations that they too were hexed, and that the source of it was Rehmeyer. So a Hess son named Wilbert, who was 18 years old, threw in with Blymere, and so did a 14-year-old named John Curry, a sad and beaten-down boy from a hard home who had latched onto Blymere as the closest thing he had to a guide. Milton Hess worked a farm that had been sliding for years with the crops thin and the animals failing. And a farm that fails slowly in that country invites exactly one explanation. Someone has hexed it. So when Blymere came to the Hesses with a name and a plan, he was not converting skeptics. He was lighting a fire that had already been laid. Not one of the three was a killer, by any natural reading of him. They were a sick man and a scared boy, and a lonely one bound together by a single shared certainty. 3 of them then, 2 of them children, walking down into the hollow on a cold night at the end of November in 1928, to take an old man's hair and an old man's book and break the curse they all believed was killing them. They went to Rehmeyer's house, and he let them in, because he knew Blymere from the old days, and the powwow world was a small one, and there is something almost unbearable in that detail, that he opened his own door to the people who had come to end him. There was the rumor of money in it too, because a man who lived alone and spent almost nothing was assumed by some to have cash hidden somewhere on the place, and that rumor rode along beside the hex without either one ever quite canceling the other. But the hex was the engine. Whatever they told themselves about hair and books and buried savings, the thing that had drawn them down the dark road was the belief that this one man held the lock on the curse. They sat, and they talked into the night, and Rehmeyer let them stay over. And they waited. And at some point in the dark, they moved on him, trying to get the book and trying to get the hair. And Nelson Rehmeyer, who was a big and powerful man, fought them. And 3 terrified people who had told themselves they were fighting for their very lives beat him down onto the floor of his own kitchen and did not stop. They bound him with rope. They struck him with a block of wood and with their fists until the big, gentle man was dead. It was not quick and it was not clean. 3 people who had walked in believing they were the victims found themselves on the floor of another man's kitchen doing the most violent thing any of them would ever do. And the awful arithmetic of a struggle like that is that fear makes people not gentler, but worse. The harder he fought, the more certain they became that the curse itself was fighting them through him, that his strength was the hex resisting. So they did not stop when a person should stop. They stopped only when there was nothing left to stop for. And then because the book had taught them that fire purifies, and because they needed to be certain the thing that had hexed them was truly destroyed, they tried to burn him. They poured lamp oil over the body and set it alight, believing the flames would finish the breaking of the spell. But the fire did not take the way they expected. It charred the body and scorched the floor, and then it smothered itself in the closed room and went out. And the house did not burn. To the killers fleeing back up out of the hollow, there was only one explanation, that a powwow doctor's body would refuse to burn. He was proof against fire just as the book had promised, and the spell had protected even his corpse. The truth was duller and sadder, and it was a matter of a shut room and not enough air. But they did not know that. They believed the curse was lifted at last, and they went home. Think about the logic of that fire for a moment, because it tells you everything about the world these men lived in. A body that would not burn was not to them a body in a closed room with too little air. It was proof. The book had promised that a powwow could not be harmed, and here in front of them was the proof that even in death the man's power held. They did not read the failure of the fire as failure. They read it as confirmation that everything they believed was true. And there is no more dangerous place for a frightened person to stand than inside a belief that turns every piece of evidence and even its own failures into more proof that the belief was right all along. It was not lifted, because there had never been a curse. There had only been a sick and desperate young man and an old woman who handed him a name, and a gentle giant at the bottom of a hollow who had never done a single thing to harm him. It did not take long to come apart. Rehmeyer's body lay in the scorched kitchen until a neighbor noticed the chimney cold and the chores undone and went down to look. And what he found brought the county constables into the hollow. The trail ran straight from there because Blymeyer had never been quiet about any of it. He had spent weeks telling people that Rehmeyer had hexed him and asking around about the man and making no secret of his hatred. And a killing in a small county where everyone knows everyone does not stay a mystery long when the killer has been announcing his motive for weeks in advance. Within days, all 3 were in custody, and the boys, once they were asked, did not have it in them to hold the thing inside. They told it. They told all of it. The hair and the book and the 8 feet of earth and the fire. In the flat, unguarded way of people who still half believed they had done something necessary rather than something monstrous. And what happened next was almost as cruel to the living community as the murder had been to the dead man, because the entire country turned to look. Reporters poured into York County from the cities. The case was called the Hex Murder and the Witch Trial, and the newspapers had a feast with it. Backwoods, Pennsylvania. German farmers who still believed in curses and spell books. The Pennsylvania Dutch, who were a private and proud people, watched their oldest healing tradition dragged into the national light and held up to the whole country as ignorance and savagery, and a way of caring for one another that went back 200 years, took a wound it never fully recovered from. The trials came in the new year, and they were a spectacle the county never asked for. The prosecution wanted nothing to do with the hex, because a curse is not a motive a court can use. And so the lawyers worked hard to keep the spellbook and the river witch out of it, and to try the thing as a plain robbery and murder. while the whole watching country wanted to hear about exactly the parts the court was trying to bury. The defense, for its part, leaned into the powwow world, because a jury that understood how completely these men believed they were fighting for their lives might be moved toward mercy. Blymeer and the boy Curry were tried together and convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. Wilbert Hess was tried separately with his own father, testifying to the family's terror and torment, and the jury hearing it returned a lesser verdict. The old woman near Marietta who had looked into a dollar bill and handed Blymeer a name was brought into it too, and questioned about her part. But the law of that day had no clean way to charge a person for a murder that began with a sentence spoken in a parlor. And she slipped back out of the story almost as quietly as she had entered it. And the slow machinery of the decades did what it does. Curry, the boy of 14, was paroled while still a young man and went on to a quiet life and painted signs and served his country in the war. Hess was released some years after that, and Blymeer, who had been so certain that the killing would free him, was not let out until the 1950s. An old man by then, having spent the bulk of his life behind walls for a murder meant to lift a curse that was never there. And he told people more than once that it had worked, that after that night in the hollow he felt better and could eat and sleep again, and that the hex was broken. He believed to the end of his days that he had cured himself by beating a man to death on a kitchen floor. The boys carried it differently than Blymeer did. The youngest of them grew up inside a prison and came out a grown man and tried to build an ordinary life on the far side of the worst thing he had ever done at the age of 14. They came down into the hollow certain that a curse was eating their lives, and certain that the cure was to destroy the man who had laid it. They were right that something invisible was eating them. They were only wrong about every single thing they did about it. And a gentleman who never hexed anyone burned slow on his own floor for a spell that was never cast, to break a curse that was only ever fear, passed from one frightened hand to the next all the way down into the dark of the hollow. If you like stories like this, the true ones and the buried ones, the kind where the monster is not a creature out in the woods but the fear that lives inside ordinary people, then you are in the right place. Welcome to Dust and Echoes. Before you go, there is something waiting for you just past the edge of this one, the newsletter. The moment you sign up, I hand you a secret story, one that lives nowhere else. Not in this feed, and not on any app, and not in any store, only on the list. I'll be sending out a new one very soon. There's a link in the podcast description below, or sign up at enterthedust.com. And if you want to hold one of these stories in your own two hands, I keep a small run of signed first editions over there too, made out to you by name, while they last. Purchasing one helps this podcast grow, and I'm sending out a free bonus gift with the next 10 books sold. I release a new story in cinematic audiobook format every single week, right here, and I think you're going to love the next one. Until next time, remember this. The most dangerous thing you can ever hand a frightened man is a name, because he will go looking for the face to match it.